Welcome to the Enterprise Fleet Summit. This is a fireside chat. I'm Thomas Wasson, trucking expert at FreightWaves, and going to be super excited to be talking about regulatory challenges. Large fleets are large, and they're impacted in a big way if any of the regulations change, proposed or actual. So joining me to talk about this is Garney. He's a co-director of Scopelitis Transportation Consulting. He happens to know a thing or two about it. He talks to these large carriers. Going to have a really great chat, getting to dive into it. And Sean, pleasure to get to talk to you again. For folks who are unfamiliar, tell us a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. I really appreciate you having me on here. My name is Sean Garney. I've been in the trucking industry for the whole of my career, having started with local pickup and delivery operations, delivering cold ice on hot days, and worked for a while as a broker for C.H. Robinson, really cutting my teeth in the industry before moving to Washington and joining the American Trucking Associations, ultimately as their director of safety policy there. I've been consulting now for Scopelitis Transportation Consulting after a short stint as a contractor to FMCSA for about 5 years now. And that's where that and in other places are where I have lots of opportunities to speak with all sorts of carriers, big and small, about regulations and safety and all that fun stuff.
Well, let's dive right in because there's a really fun one with the speed limiter legislation. You've been connected, you've gotten a pulse from many sides of the aisle here. I think this is fascinating because helpful or harmful. From a large fleet perspective, many of them have regulators. Tell us a little bit about that because it does seem like from smaller fleets, this is like a very potential big deal for them.
Yeah, that's a good question, Thomas. I think, as far as, to start with sort of the legislative footprint or what FMCSA is thinking about doing on speed limiters, I'll say that, most of the legislation that I've seen out there are just markers. This is an historically dysfunctional Congress, and so don't put a lot of credence into what they're saying up there on speed limiters. From a helpful, harmful perspective, I think it's a really interesting question, right? So you're right that I think CCJ surveyed carriers fleets last year, and something like 70% already had speed limiters installed, right? And a lot of times we talk about speed limiters from a safety perspective, which is totally appropriate, right? Because they do have safety benefits, but most of those, at least the way that FMCSA is proposing speed limiters, are really focused on reducing crash severity, right? Because what they're looking at doing is capping the top speed, right? Well, where do we drive the top speed? On the highways, on limited access highways, and that's where you're going to see that benefit. Well, we're not expecting the crash reduction there. We're expecting crash severity reduction, right? Because we're just slowing vehicles down. I think if FMCSA really wanted to make an impact, their proposal would look a little different. We'd start thinking about how to reduce speeding in our local roadways, where speeding looks a lot more like reckless driving, right? Because the roads are limited at such lower potentials. I think to your point about how larger fleets are using speed limiters, there is a crash reduction, there is a safety element to it, but I think most would tell you if you ask them, at least behind closed doors, hey, what was the most important factor in you determining that speed governors would go on your fleet? Part of that was certainly crash reduction, but an even bigger part of that was saving gallons of diesel fuel, right? Because it's just math. It does improve your, generally speaking, keeping that top end speed down does improve your crash or your fuel efficiency, I should say. And so I think that's the big part of it. I mean, another big part of the speed limiter debate, which we're not hearing as much about, is, because we like to talk about safety and how important fuel efficiency are and what the benefits are, but we're also in a political environment that is not very excited about having new rules or regulations thrust upon them. So even those that have already adopted speed limiters for their own reasons that may align with the reasons that FMCSA is proposing, may reject a mandate out of hand because it's an example of an unneeded regulation. So it should be interesting to see what happens. I'll go ahead and address what might be your next question Do I think FMCSA will finish their rulemaking before and or after the election? And I think on this particular issue, for the reasons I just articulated, I don't really think we're likely to see anything on speed limiters before the election. And the results of the election could really impact whether we see anything after the election.
And I think you have such a great point. And I listened to you talk at a conference. The FMCSA, something I hadn't considered was that, have you been approved by Congress if you're in charge of the FMCSA? And that should you pass things before you leave, like your tenure, to say I did something, or do you wait until the next administration, if there's a next one, or the current one, or if there's a new Congress, a new Senate? Talk a little bit about that, because it does seem like when I read some of the rulemaking, a lot of folks are just punting the ball downfield, and they're like, well, this is a 2025 problem. Let's just see how the dust settles, get reelected, whatever.
Yeah, that's a good point, and we are under an acting administrator. And if we have an administrator who's not Senate confirmed, there are, at least around the edges, sort of some questions about whether that administrator or acting administrator really has the mandate, and they are, I think, far less likely to wade into politically tumultuous waters for that exact reason. I mean, we as an industry are very, very aware of and used to dealing with the revolving door that has been, administrators of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. But I think in this election in particular, that calculus is extremely strong. No acting administrator, a very contentious election that has challenging undertones to it. Even the traditional Democrat-Republican dichotomy is changing based on different priorities. And so I do think, on big rulemakings, on things that make people scared, we might not see as much, right? On safety fitness procedures or on speed limiters or that sort of thing. I do think there is a chance that we could see some things that are really sort of administration focused. So all of the enforcement proposals they have out there, changes to the CSA program are one, changes to the data queues appeals process are two, the preventability program and updates to that are three. Those are not really rulemaking. They're really just enforcing the rules and how we do that. And in many cases, they're good news industry stories. And so I think those are the types of things that we could see moving until the election. But as far as, an acting administrator stepping out and, telling the industry that we'll be, implementing speed limiters in the near future, probably not the case.
Well, I want to question something that may be more near term. The Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse coming up in November. They're going down to the state level where they're checking the clearinghouse. This was fascinating. When I looked it up to preface this was part of like a 2012 initiative for like MAPS 21, this whole initiative.
Yeah.
And it takes so long. Is that something that may change? Because how I interpret it, and I want to get your thoughts on it, beforehand, the addition of the state regulatory agency means we're going to catch more folks when they try to re-get their license. And now they got to go through all the extra steps. When before, it was really up to the carriers and the other means of finding it.
Yeah. It's sort of the final piece, sort of the last loophole. And I think, I was at the American Trucking Associations when MAP 21 was passed, and I can remember sort of dealing and negotiating with this particular concept. And when FMCSA finally published their rule, they were like, okay, in states, you're going to have to check the clearinghouse and verify before you renew or issue or upgrade a license. And the states came back and said, well, you actually haven't told me what to do once I check the clearinghouse, which is a crazy thing to say because I think we all know what they should have done, but it required FMCSA to stop what they were doing, to create a second rulemaking, to be absolutely clear on how states need to respond with the clearinghouse, how they should interact, what they should do with drivers. Ultimately, yes, I think it's probably the last piece of the clearinghouse that will hopefully totally close that loop, and it's going to do that at the DMV office, which is important, right? So it's going to stop me if I'm prohibited because of a drug a drug violation or alcohol violation. It'll prohibit me from getting an upgrade, renewing or transferring my ID. But I think where we're going to see the impact more is the automatic downgrades, right? So things will start to get downgraded, And I think there's a fairly sizable community out there that really should be checking the clearinghouse, but maybe aren't, right? And they have prohibited drivers on their rolls that they're unaware of. Well, these drivers are going to start the fact that they're not qualified, I think, will be highlighted in those local stops now, right? Because mostly it's the motor carrier enforcement folks that are pinging the databases that they know how to get to make sure they're qualified. Well, now the driver's license is going to be downgraded. And that data should be more widely available to local police officers as well. So I think the whole enforcement regime is going to get stronger, and it's going to become more clear that the trucking industry is not an industry, which embraces, in any sense of the word, drug use, and it'll reinforce our safety standards. So I think it's
and looking at adding on, because I know there's so many good topics here, hours of service and personal conveyance. We have an example of a legislation like speed limiter where it's definitely a maybe because of all the crazy political stuff coming on.
Yeah.
We have the drug clearinghouse where we've passed it, but oh crap, we need to adjust it and give more guidance. Personal conveyance and PC usage for drivers and small fleets. Is this something large fleets really worry about? Because I know small carriers can use it as a loophole. The guiding, the wording is very vague. If I'm a large carrier, if I'm an ATA, do I want to make sure that there's very hard limits in that as well? Because I'd hate the fact that I've heard many large fleets don't even have a PC policy.
Yeah, that's so much to unpack there. I'm not even sure where to start. I think that personal conveyance is a challenge for everybody. I think some fleets are fortunate enough that they can have a zero tolerance policy, and that can work for them, where other fleets maybe less so, right? Their drivers just need additional flexibility. If my route is out and back every day, that's pretty easy for me. But if it's different, if we need to provide the opportunity for drivers to go to entertainment or to food from where they stop, they're going to have to be able to use personal conveyance. And then furthermore, if I'm a big fleet and I run owner operators, right? Well, I'm not to control those owner operators. And so I'm not to tell them necessarily, what they should be doing in their off time. And so personal conveyance has sort of another meaning over there. And how fleets want to handle personal conveyance, it's divergent across the board. Some like the Canadian model, where you say, okay, I've got an hour and 75 kilometers. Of course, in the US, we wouldn't say kilometers, but you get what I'm saying, because that's easy to follow. And law enforcement certainly wants that. They've petitioned to FMCSA at least twice and been denied, saying we want a standard that's easy to stick to. Meanwhile, we're stuck with FMCSA's sort of gray and squishy interpretation, and then even more so, law enforcement's interpretation of what they think FMCSA meant when they passed their rules, which makes it very difficult for us to really fully comply and understand. Does personal conveyance have a place in the trucking industry? Yes. I mean, this is America. And, not to get too flag wavy on you, but, what I do in my off-duty time really shouldn't probably be regulated, right? But in the same sense, how do we erect the infrastructure, the standards that can make sure that we stay safe and that we're not fatigued when we drive? So it's a tough balancing act, and I couldn't speak for large fleets or small fleets on this issue, because each fleet that I interact with wants something different out of it. Some fleets will come and say, okay, we've heard from our drivers that personal conveyance is important, but we want to find a way, to limit it. And we've heard from others to say, well, it's best that we just don't, that we don't interact with that, because our owner operators, they own their trucks, and they should be allowed to do what they need. And so, the operational impacts, the parking problems, all of that sort of make personal conveyance a necessary danger.
Looking ahead to 2025, everyone's doing predictions on the market. Looking ahead for regulatory, if I had to place my odds on the truck pool instead of the dead pool, coming from FMCSA, DOT, Congress, or something external, what's your biggest thing that you think we need to pay attention to on the horizon? Where do we need to look at our eyes to see the details?
Oh, man. Well, I think, boy, that's a hard one. Next year, we're going to start thinking about reauthorizing the infrastructure law. That's going to be huge. And we should all be laser focused on that. Depending on the makeup of Congress, that is where everybody talks about the top line funding numbers. What I like to think about and look at are the policy provisions that go into that. And there's been a lot of stuff percolating around Congress for the last couple of years being introduced and just set. Those are all markers. Those are just waiting for a vehicle. And so as we move through the authorization process, we're going to see a lot of those things introduced. Some of them may make it, some of them won't, and a lot of them will be impactful. And I could speak to specifics, but I know I have just a minute. And so for 2025, let's stay focused on reauthorization and how that's going to impact the trucking industry from a policy and regulatory perspective.
Perfect, Sean. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah.
Folks want to learn more, get in contact, find out about Scopelitis. Best way to find out?
Oh, go to our website, scopelitisconsulting.com.
Perfect.
That's
Succinct. I love it.
That's
Keep an eye on the prize, see whose pet projects get passed in Congress. A lot of great stuff. Thank you so much. As always, that's a wrap for this Fireside Chat. Don't worry, folks. Got a lot more great content coming up the pipeline. Stay tuned.